what we call the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money. And what this theory, this is the theory that came about from Milton Friedman's work, and it asserts that in the long run, real GDP is at its potential, and velocity is constant. Asserts that in the long run, real GDP is at its potential and velocity is constant. Therefore, increases in the money supply lead to equal increases in the price level. More shortly, or more succinctly put, a percentage change in the money supply equals the percentage change in the price level. Monetary policy is ultimately inflationary. Now, I know some of you guys are struggling to figure out, well, what's inflation again? And, we got to work through those bugs. That was some of the Chapter 4, Chapter 5 stuff. But this is kind of a big statement. What we said before is that, well, we don't really care about inflation. If the prices of stuff at Walmart goes up by 10%, do I care? Well, yeah, I care if my income stays constant. But if my income goes up by 10% and the prices on the shelves at Walmart go up by 10%, I can buy the same amount of stuff I used to be able to buy, right? So if resource prices and output prices move up together, I don't really care about inflation. So that's significant because there's a lot of brain power, especially in today's economy, that's been put into monetary policy. Milton Friedman's claim is that in the long run, so that's what I mean by ultimately here, is inflationary. Monetary policy is ultimately inflationary. So his prescription was to not really do monetary policy. So since it don't matter, why do it? Since it don't matter in the long run, I better keep adding that little caveat, meaning that there are some short-run effects that might kick in. Since it don't matter in the long run, why do it? Maybe we should just have a policy of, for example, set the percentage change in money supply equal to 3%. So in other words, the policy by the government would be, this year we're going to increase money supply by 3%. That's our policy. Next year, it's going to be 3%. The following year after that, it's going to be 3%. 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. If Milton Friedman's concept is right, what do you, as principles of macroeconomics students, predict that that inflation will be if the Federal Reserve does this as a policy, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. What do you predict inflation will be? 3%. See how simple that makes it? So that's kind of the gist of what Milton Friedman was getting at, is that the government injects more issues into the economy, more uncertainty, less transparency, by continuing to tinker here, tinker there, increase the money supply, decrease it. Well, maybe we should do this program, maybe we should buy long-term bonds, maybe we should buy short-term bonds. And it ends up just being kind of a big cloud that makes it harder for us to make decisions. Because as we've learned so far, there's a lot of things that are linked to inflation for you to make efficient decisions. For you to know if the pay increase that you got from your boss of 5% is good or bad, right? So inflation matters, we know that. But you can see how much more clarity we potentially bring to society by having one less thing out there to try to predict with uncertainty. So if this is it, then long-run inflation will equal 3%. Less uncertainty. Less uncertainty with decisions. Okay, so last time where all of this came from, I put on the board. So the next component of this that you need to know for the test is the equation of exchange. The equation of exchange is kind of tied into this quantity theory of money. That was the one that said, you know, if we look at nominal GDP, which we're kind of expressing a little bit strange here, but this is real GDP. This is the price level, the average price of things. Price times quantity gives us nominal GDP in a given year. The dollar value of stuff that's being exchanged. The top part of our market, in the goods market, C plus I plus G plus X, the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries over the course of a year, that stuff is bought with money. There's a quantity of money that is used to buy that stuff. Those dollars get spent many times in a given year. We can look at the average number of times that a dollar gets spent, we call velocity. So this is the equation of exchange that then helps us start to see what Milton Friedman was thinking about with this quantity theory of money. All right. The last little augmentation I want to do to this is to take the equation of exchange and think about it in terms of percentage changes, which might help tie together this inflation business and other things. So if I'm not going to derive any super sophisticated mathematical stuff here, but if we think about these in percentage changes, the multiplication ends up being an addition problem. So you can just take my word on that or look in the textbook. But we can think about the percentage change in the price level plus the percentage change in real GDP. Both of those things you saw from chapter 4 and 5, right? Real economic growth, the amount of stuff that we have going on, the rate of change of the price level, we dealt with those things changing around, is equal to the rate of change of money growth plus the rate of change of velocity. All they've done is kind of broke it down into these little components. Well, what we observe in the data, and what we probably our gut would tell us kind of makes sense, is that is there any reason to believe that over time the number of times the average dollar gets spent changes? You know, does that seem to change over time? The answer to that's no. It's pretty consistent at the M2 level. So the number of times that money being measured as M2 gets changed, if we look at the data, it's pretty flat. So this ends up being 0. So this is pretty no change. So if we dump that off of the equation, we start to see how inflation comes about. We know inflation is the percentage change in the price level. And then I just want to dump this term over to the other side of the equation, and we get kind of a nice interpretation that we'll think about. Inflation ends up being the difference between money supply growth and real GDP growth. So for a moment, go back to our island and think about the amount of stuff that's going on year after year after year. If we had 1,000 units of stuff being traded that turned out to be $1,000 of real GDP, and this year we had double. We had 2,000 units being traded, right? So I'm thinking real GDP, so there's more stuff being exchanged. If money wasn't going up at the same time, if the money supply wasn't going up, would it take more dollars or less dollars for each transaction? There's only a fixed amount of money. So let's just say that money supply growth is 0. There's no change in the money supply. If the money supply was 100 today, it's 100 tomorrow, right? So we've got 1,000 units being traded versus 2,000 units being traded. We start thinking about the number of dollars that it takes. If we're not keeping up with the change in the units of stuff, then prices are going to be altered. And the inflation rate is going to match GDP. So by throwing more money into the system, if I take my dollars, I don't have my dollars out, and I inject more money into the system, that can keep up with the amount of activity. So if these two things equal each other, inflation would be 0. There wouldn't be any real price effect going on. And so the inflation rate that's attributable to money supply growth is anything that's above real GDP growth. So we can look at this equation to kind of think about the logistics there. We've got more dollars needed to trade more goods. Real GDP growth, as we're going to go over in our review session, came from more labor, more capital, more things that caused us to be able to make more stuff. Well, if we keep the dollars that are floating around the island up with the actual quantity of things we're making, then prices would remain constant. A loaf of bread that was $1.50 5 years ago would still be $1.50. Imagine that, right? So if we were able to match those two things up, there would be no movement in prices. But what we've seen over the last, since about the Great Depression, has been inflation going up, and that's because money supply growth has exceeded real GDP growth. And that's what's causing there to be persistent inflation over time.